And thank you, dear folks. As a pastor mentioned, this particular book is the first book I ever wrote. It's been in print for almost 30 years now. It's been translated in 7 or 8 languages. It's a very simple book designed to explain our Baptist heritage, and it's not directed to preachers or theologians. It's directed to the average Christian in the pew. That's on purpose. It was designed that way. It doesn't read like a research paper. It tells a story. And we're going to tell a little bit of the story this evening. And if you want more of it, it's there in that book. But go with me to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 tells the story of the Old Testament saints and the glory that some of them had. But also, as you get to the end of Hebrews 11, which is where we're going, some of the persecution that they faced. Okay? And let's pick up reading about verse 32. And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of the sword, escaped the edge of the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received the dead raised to life. Again, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. That would be the title for the message tonight. These folks suffered for the things of God. The world was not worthy of these people. They wandered in deserts, in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. These all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Chapter 12 starts with, wherefore? I was going back to chapter 11. Wherefore, seeing we're also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. And it goes on to challenge us to live for the Lord, because we have a great cloud of witnesses. In this case, it was the Old Testament saints, and the heritage they gave us. This written 2,000 years ago. We have a great heritage since then that I'd like to talk about. And let me say, when I talk about this and I talk about Baptist and so forth, you were with me Sunday afternoon. By Baptist, I'm not talking about the name on the door. I'm talking about a set of doctrines that define who we are and what we believe. There are people with the name on the door, Baptist, that do not believe these things. That's sad. There have been people throughout 2,000 years that believe these things, and they have been called by a wide variety of names. And we'll get some of them tonight, and more of them I discuss in the book. But let me remind you real quickly, I'm talking about folks that believe sole authority scripture, a regenerated church membership in an independent autonomous churches, the priesthood of all believers, the separation of church and state, and 2 ordinances, no sacraments, but 2 ordinances, baptism by immersion of believers only, and the Lord's Supper. Now, let me say very clearly, the early church that we read about in the book of Acts begins believing all of these things, and you can see all of these things clearly in the operation of the early church. The Bible was clearly their only authority. Okay? They debated at times what the Bible said, but the Bible was clearly their sole authority. They did not have a headquarters. They did not obey the state when the state told them to disobey the Bible. The Bible was the only authority referred to. And you read again and again in the book of Acts about people being saved and then being added to the church. They were added to the church after they were saved. I just read moments before coming over here. Preacher that I have not felt was a sound preacher, but he's had some following on the internet, and somebody just sent me, said, this is him giving his salvation testimony. Preacher of some prominence. He preaches in independent Baptist circles some. He says he cannot remember any moment where he got saved that he had always believed, and he didn't have a moment of conversion. Boy, that's frightening. And that might explain some of his foolish ideas, frankly. The new church in the book of Acts, folks get saved, they get added to the church. You don't get born a church member. And the priesthood of all believers was plain. People were challenged to live for the Lord, but there was nobody to make them live for the Lord. Between them and God. And Peter would write and say, you're a holy priesthood. There's nothing like that in the Old Testament. Believers were never referred to as all being priests in the Old Testament. But you and I are referred to as being priests. And then separation of church and state. We see them bringing Peter and John and the apostles in on two separate occasions, saying, do not tell anybody Jesus rose from the dead anymore. And they're saying things like, we cannot but speak the things which we've seen and heard. And that we ought to obey God rather than man. And we see them practicing baptism. And any question about what baptism is like, and that goes back to the very beginning. You're reading in the book of Mark how when they had baptism, Jesus was baptized, they came out of the water. And you see the story of Philip witnessing to the Ethiopian eunuch and leading him to Christ. And the Ethiopian eunuch asks, what hinders me from being baptized? There's only one qualification for being baptized, that's that you've been saved. And then this guy said, well, there's much water here. They come to an oasis. And you need much water. Out in the desert, the Ethiopian eunuch would have been carrying water with him. But that wasn't sufficient for baptism. To have baptism, you have to be able to take a person and put them under the water, because that pictures burial. We do not bury people by laying them on the ground and sprinkling some dust on them. That would be frightening. We put people under the ground. We put people under the water. We bring them up out of the water. I love baptizing folks. I miss that about pastoring. There was something special about that moment. And there was something special about them and the joy they had having been obedient to the Lord. I have a lot of baptism stories. I baptized one fellow was 6'11". Baptistry wasn't really designed for him. We had to angle it and have him stand in one corner. We're in one corner, you know, and that was something. I was going to baptize a 6-year-old girl. We baptized several people. I hadn't even thought about this. We came time for her to come out. The water was too deep for her. It was over her head. And I realized that just as she's about to come out. So I got to do something. So I just sent somebody to get a folding chair. We put the folding chair in the middle of the baptistry, and I had her stand on the folding chair, and I baptized her off the chair. First church I pastored had a baptistry just like this, and then the choir right from the baptistry. And I don't know why. It was their tradition. If you had a baptism, you opened the service with it. And so you'd have the choir sitting up there, and they'd just be sitting here, and they'd turn to look back at the baptistry. We had a fellow get saved. Was a professional wrestler. Somebody called me, told me he had just been in this confrontation, and he was all shook up, and he was saying that a person had actually pointed a gun at him and pulled the trigger, and the gun didn't fire. And he was saying that apparently God had something for him, but he didn't know what it was. And this guy said, I can get you in the house to talk to him. Would you be willing to go? And I went over and led him to Christ and led his wife to Christ and his 3 sons to Christ. And it was wonderful. But this man was big. And I explained to him, the next step is baptism. And he said, well, can I see the baptistry? And we went over to the church. And he said, at my size, I'm afraid I would push up so much water, it would come over the edge. And I have an ornery side to me. I could just picture that happening and the water coming up all over the choir and all that. But so I'll tell you what we'll do. I said, we'll move baptism to the end of the service so there's nobody sitting up there. And then I went out and put plastic up over the chairs. And it was the truth, man. We baptized him and the water came up and over. As I mentioned, I've baptized in Syria where it's illegal. And I've baptized in Egypt where it's illegal. And I've baptized in Israel where it is legal. And I'm the only person I know that's baptized in Syria, Egypt, and Israel, all 3. I have a lot of baptism stories. Had precious moments. Had interesting moments. And as I mentioned, the heavy-set people were always afraid. Boy, I said, you're going to get in the water and I won't be able to get back up. And that's the opposite of the way it is. You put a heavier person under the water pushes them back up. It's the smaller ones. They'll float. And I've had some interesting floating moments over a period of time. Glory to God. You find them practicing baptism. And then when you get into Corinthians, you find the teaching about the Lord's Supper and specific instruction given about it. I have no apology for saying that the New Testament church was Baptist. They didn't say they have that name. They practiced all of the Baptist distinctives and these precious doctrines. As time goes on, you find a state church developing, and this state church will not believe any of these things. They don't believe the Bible is only authority, the church is authority. They don't believe in regenerated church membership. They believe you get born a church member, and so they eventually developed the idea of baptizing babies. That made you a member. They didn't believe in independent autonomous churches. They were the state church. They didn't believe the priesthood of all believers. They had certain people set aside as priests. They certainly didn't believe in the separation of church and state. In earlier times, they controlled the state. Later would be controlled by the state. And they eventually developed 7 sacraments, which they said were the ways that you get saved through these 7 points of obedience. But as that happened, we find out New Testament church spread everywhere. It comes to a point where it's being persecuted by the Roman Empire. And you see these people being persecuted over 300 years. It's called the heroic age of the church. Millions of people literally got killed. Copies of the scripture burnt. Church buildings burnt, and all these things. But it's in the Roman Empire. But you came to an unusual moment in the Roman Empire where there were 4 different men claiming to be the emperor, and there's a 4-way civil war. And one of them came up with a brilliant idea, that needs some way to break this conflict. So he adopted, in theory, Christianity and welcomed Christians into his coalition. They hadn't been fighting for anybody because everybody had been putting them to death. They didn't have anybody to fight for. And bringing the Christians into his coalition upset the balance and allowed him to take control. And he then made Christianity part of the state. And many of the Christians were willing to accept that simply because they were tired of the endless, nonstop persecution. But there were always groups that would pop up independently and say, this isn't the Bible, we're going to obey the Bible. And they get called by different names. Sometimes they get called by the name of a prominent preacher. Sometimes they get called by the name of something they're teaching. Sometimes they get called by the name of the region that they're in. For example, early, as the state church developed, There's a preacher named Donatus, a preacher named Montanus, a preacher named Novatian, and they preached all of these things we call the Baptist distinctives today. And groups of churches believing that rose up under the influence of their preaching, and they got called Donatist churches or Montanist churches or Novatian churches. And especially all over northern Africa at that time. And there were those folks that continued to believe these precious truths. They endured persecution, now not just at the hands of the Roman Empire, but they endured persecution from the state church. People called Christians were persecuting Christians. And here's where people get confused. They'll look at the history of any of these movements I'm about to talk about. Movements change over a period of time. And people will look at the history of the end of that movement. Every movement I'm going to mention to you eventually goes apostate and is replaced by other Bible-believing movements. You can't just look at the end of a movement to understand its history. Give you an example. Novatians, Donatists, Montanus eventually are virtually wiped out. But as other groups raise up, for example, all over what's now the Mideast, there were independent churches, and they called them Paulicians. You know why they called them Paulicians? They kept quoting Paul so much. Where is all the instruction to be found about how to be a New Testament church? In the writings God gave through Paul. So state church would say this and this and this, and they'd go to something from Paul. And the state church liked to appeal to the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, Israel was one nation with one religion, and they liked to think they did not like the idea that God had different dispensations. And so these independent churches who believed all of these things, we know what they believed. They had a doctrines book called The Key of Truth that has been recovered and translated, and it has every one of these precious teachings in it. They got called Paulicians because they quoted Paul so much. And they didn't believe the writings of Paul was the only scripture, but they did believe it's where you got the instruction about how to have a New Testament church. And there are periods of time when they weren't persecuted as much as at other times. They ended up, and when the Roman Empire split there in the eastern half, that became the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire, it gets challenged by Islam as it develops, and it's a constant warfare with Islam, and sometimes they would make peace with the Paulicians because they wanted the Paulicians' help in withstanding the Muslims. But at other times, they persecuted them. They put them to death. At one point, the Byzantine Empire was led by a woman known as Empress Theodora. And she would end up putting 100,000 Paulicians to death in one day. Some of the Paulicians broke away. They started a country. They called it Tabriz. It's in what's modern day Iran. And Tabriz was the first country in the world where the people were given a written guarantee of religious freedom. And for a while, boy, it just stood out as a place where the gospel was preached and people were free. But it would eventually be conquered by Islam. And in the city of Tabriz today, when I say today, I mean today, there are Christians calling for a return to the religious freedom that the city was once known for. This continues. Eventually, the Paulicians, 800 years after they started, the Paulicians would become heretics. They developed some very foolish ideas, and some historians, when they talk about them, only want to talk about what they were like at the end of this 800-year period. But the truth is, for centuries before that, they preached the gospel and they preached these truths we call the Baptist distinctives. Some of them went on into Eastern Europe. They called them the Bogomils. There were hundreds and hundreds of Bogomil churches. They came to a point for a while that they dominated the government in what would become Bulgaria and Albania, and they had religious freedom. But again, the persecution would come, and they end up getting wiped out. But every time one group is wiped out or one group goes heretical, other groups arise to take their place. The Roman Empire broke up. You went into the time called the Dark Ages. During that time, the various regions of Europe begin to form gradually into the modern day countries of Europe. Again and again, you find these independent, Bible-believing churches pop up here and there. They had different names. Some of them got called the Cathari. And the criticism of the Cathari is they believed you had to be saved to be a church member. We know that truth. Folks, there's a city in modern-day France called Albi. And there were so many independent churches in Albi that they began to call independent churches Albigensians. And as the Roman Empire died, the state church became stronger and stronger, became the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the Roman Catholic emperors, the ironic name of Innocent III, issued a decree that all the independent Christians had to be killed. And he taught them to fear somebody called interdict. He said when a pope has absolute authority and the pope issues interdict on a country, everybody in that country will die and go to hell. Forever, no purgatory. And there were people who believed that. And as he issued that interdict, the people of that region were fearful of their eternal destiny, and armies moved against Albi. And the problem was some of the people in Albi were Catholic and some of them were independents. Very famous moment when word was sent to the generals surrounding the city. You got to be careful. You got to figure out who's Catholic and who the Albigenses are. And his response was, kill them all and let God sort them out. And they wipe out that city, killing thousands and thousands of Catholics. At the same time, they kill the independent churches, independent church people. Another group followed a man named Henry of Lausanne, and he preached everything we know as the Baptist distinctives. They called him Henricians. And another fellow named Peter preached these truths, and they called his followers Peter-Brussians, but he clearly taught these Baptist truths various places in Europe. And you begin to see these things everywhere. A fellow named Arnold preached these truths, and he preached that the Roman Catholic control was evil, and he formed an army and marched to Rome and ran the Pope out of Rome. But then the Pope formed a bigger army and came back and retook Rome, and Arnold gets burned at the stake. This is called the Dark Ages, but all through what's called the Dark Ages, there are numbers of independent churches popping up here, there, and everywhere. Some of them we know a lot about, and we have their writings. Some of them we don't know much about. Pope Innocent III himself, who was desperate to destroy these people, made the statement that 50% of the people in Europe belonged to independent churches. During this time, Catholicism spread to England, modern-day Britain. When they got there, they found out there were independent churches all over the British Isles. And they insisted they join into Catholicism. They're called the Celtic Christians, and they refused. They refused because they believed in independent churches. They refused because they didn't believe in independent baptism, or infant baptism. And you don't have to be a Baptist to understand all this. Winston Churchill writes a great deal about this in the history of Britain, and they fought war after war after war, until finally the Catholic armies were able to overcome Britain and make Britain Catholic. But the truth is, at no point did the British people submit to the Catholic Church the way that the other European countries did. They were constantly saying no and resisting and being a problem. John Wycliffe would eventually rise up, and he would translate the Bible into English because he believed everybody should be able to have the Bible for themselves. Previously, it just existed for the priests. And Wycliffe translated, and it was in Latin. Wycliffe translated it into English. Interesting. I've been to the church Wycliffe pastored. It's still in operation today. The actual building, they have two buildings today. A modern building that's made to look old on the outside when you go in. It's got electricity and air conditioning. But the original building, and they have Sunday morning service there in the original building with the ancient pulpit that Wycliffe had. And they have stained glass windows, and that's what they have for lighting. I've been there. Dr. David Brown and I were there. We were on the tour. While we were on the tour, we met the pastor there, and we got to talking with him, and we left the tour and spent the next couple hours with him. Man who believes the plan of salvation. And he showed us because Wycliffe was protected by some of the nobility from persecution. But after he died, and this pastor took us and showed us that this is the spot where Wycliffe was buried. After he died, they came and dug up his body and burnt the body at the stake because this is what they believed. They believed when people died, when Catholics died, they went to purgatory and they had to finish paying for their sins in purgatory. But they believed if you were burnt by the Catholic Church, you did not go to purgatory, you went to hell and you never got out. So they were fearful that Wycliffe was in purgatory and he would get out someday. So they dug up his dead body, burn it at the stake, because they believed that would consign him to hell forever. And I don't know how much the Lord lets folks in heaven know about what's going on the earth, but I just got the feeling that Wycliffe was up in heaven laughing at all this when they were doing that. They actually still preach the gospel in that church. And it's fascinating. We've stayed in touch. Dr. Brown and I have stayed in touch with that preacher. Other groups rose up in England. They called them Lollards. They preached all of the things we call the Baptist distinctives today. They were all over England. So many of them were taken, and they were taken to London, and they were tried, and they were kept in a tower until their sentence was carried out, and most of them were killed. And to this day, it's called Lollard Tower. And you can go there in England. And in Lollard's Tower, you can take a tour of Lollard's Tower, and they will tell you the story of all of the people who were executed there. Did y'all catch this? Old Testament saints. God's working through the author of Hebrews, who I think was Paul, challenging the early church. We need to be faithful to the Lord, because we have a group of witnesses. We have a heritage of the people who went before us, the Old Testament believers. So we should be faithful to the Lord because of their example. But y'all get this? We have a heritage of believers who went before us, known as Baptists. They didn't all call themselves that. Some of this I know is our going back and saying, look, they believe the Baptist distinctives, so we're going to call them Baptists. Be it that as it may, there is a heritage of people who went before us that believed these truths that ended up paying an incredible price for it. We have witnesses and a heritage. People for whom the world was indeed not worthy. Groups rose up all over Europe. Some of them, as I said, we know a lot about. Some of them we don't know that much about. There was a fellow named Berengarius. A pope issued a decree against him, accused him of teaching things that were contrary to the church, accused him of teaching everything that's a Baptist distinctive. And the pope said he's got at least 800,000 followers. We don't know anything about him but that pope's decree. I got the feeling we're going to meet a lot of interesting folks in heaven that we don't necessarily know anything about, that the gospel's been more influential and more powerful throughout the centuries than we ever knew. Because here's a principle, when they're trying to kill you and you're on the run, you don't stop and write books. You don't tell everybody where you're at. I have been to Vietnam. As I told you, I met with Baptist preachers there. They don't have church buildings. If you had a church building, the government would know exactly where to find you. They meet in a different place every Sunday. We might meet at your house this Sunday. We might meet over in this garden next Sunday. They change location every week, which makes it harder for the authorities to find them. Some of these folks we know just a mention of. Some of these folks we do know a fair amount about. That rose up in Germany and in Switzerland. Many of these independent churches, and they called them Anabaptists. They began to call them Anabaptists in Switzerland and the 1500s. And this is where the name Baptist comes from. They called them Anabaptists. They said you're rebaptizers. When somebody who'd been baptized as an infant in the Catholic Church got saved, they baptized them scripturally. And their answer to that is, we're not Anabaptists. We're not rebaptizing anybody. Getting sprinkled as a baby is not baptism. So their answer was not Anabaptist, Baptist. 1500s, shortly after the invention of the printing press. And the story of what happened with the Anabaptists and their famous answer, Baptist, not Anabaptist, gets written up and it gets printed and goes all over Europe. And then all of a sudden, for the first time, everybody was using the same name for these truths. And the name stuck. And it's been the name ever since. And all over England, attempt after attempt to do away with these folks. But whenever you would destroy them over here, they pop up somewhere else. There are a handful of churches today in England who trace their heritage back over 1,000 years. Handful of Baptist churches. Really got attention. A fellow named John Smith began to preach these truths and make an issue out of it. And there began to rise up more and more Baptists. King James, of King James Bible fame, when he became king, it had been the policy for years to burn Baptist preachers at the stake. Hundreds of years. When he was king, they burned 2 Baptist preachers at the stake. And King James, who I believe was a saved man, I have a chapter on that in my book Unbroken, but he saw it, he said, never again. This will never happen again as long as I'm king. And he outlawed burning at the stake, period, of anybody as a form of execution. But I say, we'll no longer kill anyone for their faith. It was a horrible experience to watch. And it touched his heart, and he said, never again. And Baptists began to rise up here and there and all kinds of things. They developed 3 groups of Baptists, 3 primary names. There were what were called the particular Baptist. They were Calvinist-type Baptists. They believed Christ only died for some people, some particular people. But they had to match that with the Baptist distinctives. There were what was called General Baptists. They believed Christ died for everybody. but they also believed you could lose your salvation. They adopted the teachings of a man named Jacob Arminius. In both cases, they were moving away from sole authority Scripture. If you're following Calvin or Arminius or anybody else, then the Bible is not your only authority. But there was a third group who called themselves regular Baptist. They were not named after any particular person. There's a danger in any idea that can be named after a person. They said, we're regular Baptists. In other words, we believe the truths the Swiss Anabaptists made famous. We're regular Baptists. And during that time, of course, you have people from England crossing the ocean to start colonies in the New World. And people came to start colonies. It was quite a thing to cross an ocean to start a colony and brave the wilderness and brave the weather and brave the Indians and etc. Which had 13 English colonies. Each one started for kind of different reasons. But among those reasons, how could you get people to come? Some people came for gold. Some people came for freedom, political freedom. Some people came for religious freedom. And there were a number of different groups that did. But among those colonies, there were a lot of Baptists that came because they wanted to be free to have what they believed were biblical churches without being harassed and directed and misused by the government. One whole colony, Rhode Island, was started by Baptists simply because they wanted a place for religious freedom. A couple people very influential, Roger Williams, John Clark. The church that John Clark started is still in existence. I have been there. His grave is interesting. It's right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. There's a house and a lot, house and a lot, house and a lot. And then there's this fenced-in lot, no house. And inside the fence, and I've been there and been inside the fence, is where John Clark is buried. And it has a large monument. Some other members of his family are buried in there. A large monument that testified to the part that he played in bringing Baptist freedom to the United States and teaching the doctrine of religious liberty. And then you go a couple blocks over to the actual church building where he started. And out of those early times of bringing Baptists over, a fellow named Shubal Stearns started preaching this in the colonial area and started preaching these things. And an explosion came out, and Shubal Stearns Church, and I have been there, started sending people out to start Baptist churches all over the colonies. Last week, from Sunday through Wednesday, I was at Double Springs Baptist Church in Kingston, Tennessee. That was started 245 years ago during a colonial period by a preacher sent out by Shubal Stearns Church. It's got quite a history. In the early days of the church, they were still battling with Indians in the area. So when he came to church, all the men brought their muskets. And they had pews, but they had all the men had the muskets with them. And at some point, they'd been 20 years without any Indian trouble, and the men were still, by habit, coming to church and bringing their muskets with them. And they had a business meeting, and the ladies in the church were complaining. Said, "Don't you think it's time to quit coming to church armed? We haven't had any trouble in 20 years." That church still there. And churches got started all over the place. And Baptist ideas began to be influential, and then began to spread. In the colony of Virginia, they had a law that said only Church of England could have churches, preachers. But there were Baptists, independent Baptists, preaching all around Virginian places. And they arrested 3 of them, and they put them on trial. And Patrick Henry One of the two most famous men in Virginia, along with George Washington, was not a Baptist, but he heard they were prosecuting these three Baptist preachers for preaching without a license, and that they're planning on putting them in prison. He just shows up after the trial started and volunteers to help the defense lawyers. So he comes in, he introduces himself, he tells the judge, I arrived here late. He said, could we have a moment for me to look at the indictment, the papers that charge, a person with a crime? So they give him a copy of the indictment. Patrick Henry's famous. He's the give me liberty or give me death speech. So he's in the courtroom, and he's walking around with the papers, and the story's recorded. He's walking around. He starts waving the papers around. He says, this is an incredible moment. Here we are with every challenge this colony faces. Indian attacks on the border. He said, today we're using all of our time and money and energy to prosecute these three men for horrible, heinous, unforgivable crime of preaching the gospel of the Son of God. He walks around the courtroom some more, looking through the papers. He said, this is just amazing. See, here we are today in a colony beset with a multitude of financial problems. And he said, you know what we're devoting our time to here today? Prosecuting these three men for the villainous crime of preaching the gospel of the Son of God so that people could be converted. He continues to walk around the courtroom looking at it. The courtroom is still there in Virginia. The very courtroom is in. I have been there. I have preached in the town it's in. That courtroom, that historic courtroom, famous one, is a restaurant today. That building, all those years back, I've eaten in the restaurant where Patrick Henry did all this. He walks around, we're looking at the rest of the paper, third time, he said, here we are, the most challenging moment in the history of our colony. We're on the verge of a war with Mother England. We have issues that we do not have answers to. And what are we spending all of our time and money and effort on here today? Prosecuting these three unredeemed villains for the evil of having preached the gospel of the Son of God. Then he moved for a dismissal. And eventually the jury, in an act of jury nullification, would go against the law of the colony and find them all innocent and let them go. Time went on, more and more people got attached to this Baptist teaching of separation of church and state. There came a time in England, and Patrick Henry said, well, we can't go around persecuting everybody. He offered a compromise. He got George Washington to back it, said, we'll license 4 churches. Church of England, the Baptist, the Methodist, and Presbyterian, will make those the 4 legal churches. Church of England accepted it. The Methodists accepted it. Presbyterian Church accepted it. Baptist said, no. We don't want to be one of the legal churches. We want religious liberty. We don't want there to be such a thing as legal churches. And this battle and discussion goes on. Finally, the United States wins the war for independence, becomes an independent nation. They fuss about how to govern it. They finally come up with the idea of the Constitution, and the Constitution was laid out. And in the Constitution, it says as soon as 9 colonies or 9 states adopt this, it becomes a law of the land. And it pretty quickly got adopted by 8, but there was a hard time. And the rest, Virginia was the most prominent colony. And there was a debate in Virginia. George Washington said we need to adopt it. Patrick Henry said no. We don't want that strong a central government. And so the people moved by Washington on one side, Henry on the other side. James Madison was in Virginia. He was the the man who wrote the text of the Constitution, the Baptists had not come out on either side. James Madison came to a prominent Baptist preacher named John Ryland. And he said, I want you to endorse the Constitution. He said, I can't endorse it. There's nothing in the Constitution about religious liberty. And Madison said, I give you my word that if the Constitution becomes a law of the land, there's provision for amendments. He said, I will not rest until the First Amendment adopted grants religious liberty. And Ryland and the Baptist preachers believed him. They came out for the Constitution. They swung the debate. The Constitution gets adopted because of them, and a miracle happened. A politician kept a promise. Yeah, I know. It's just hard to believe. In the day and age in which we live, Madison immediately went to work to make the First Amendment religious liberty, and succeeded. And they built a statue to John Ryland for having made the Constitution possible. That statue still exists. It's not a major tourist point anymore. And if you happen to go there, most people, who's that? And Baptists had such influence and grew and spread, and they went west with the settlers. In almost every community, the first church was a Baptist church. You can go to modern-day Cincinnati, which was 7 different towns originally that grew into each other. And the first church in every one of those 7 towns was a Baptist church. When it all grew together and became one town, they had a challenge because they had 7 First Baptist churches. And so all the churches had to decide to change their names to avoid confusion. And there was quite a controversy over all that. But you ended up with 7 different churches with 7 different names. And Baptists would impact this country in incredible fashion. Challenges came. Some Baptists opposed slavery, some didn't. And that became an issue. They had issues over other things. But for a period of time, the largest group of Americans that identified with any religion were Baptists. As time would go on and so many immigrants came from other countries, became the largest group of people in America identified with Roman Catholicism. But Baptists were influential. Time I referred to earlier, you came to the time of the fundamentalist, modernist controversy. Baptists were all over the United States, at seminaries and colleges in every state. But modernism came. The idea of challenging the inspiration of the Bible, the idea of personal salvation, heaven and hell, and so forth. And modernism began to grow among Baptists. Under the leadership of a number of different people, David Otis Fuller, William Briley, Ford Porter, folks like that, 1920s, 1930s, they said, we won't be any part of that. And sometimes they were able to get churches to change their identification. They started new churches. They lost almost all the colleges. They started new colleges, new seminaries, and all across the country, in order to make their point, they began to refer to themselves as independent, fundamental Baptists, which is the story of your church. You are part of the independent fundamental Baptist movement. Man, have we had folks that went before us? We have a heritage. There's a heritage that has been handed to us from faithful Bible believers over 2,000 years, 20 centuries of the New Testament dispensation. This is not, as some people call it, the dispensation of grace. Salvation has always been by grace. This is the dispensation of the church. The church did not exist before the New Testament. It will not exist, by the way, after the rapture. But it's the defining characteristic of this 2,000-year dispensation is a local church. And we have a heritage that's gone before us. We have a great cloud of witnesses who have handed this to us. Joking last week, I'm in a 245-year-old church. I said, are there any original members here? Anybody here when they started this? Anybody here when they had the great musket debate? And the women insisted the men quit coming armed to church. I said, you understand that, church? A generation believed these truths and handed it to another generation. That believed these truths and handed it to another generation. Who believed these truths and handed it to another generation. In their case, 245 years. Hadn't been that long here. But this isn't the generation that started this church. A group of independent fundamental Baptists who believe these doctrines and would stand for them even though it would generate criticism and opposition, handed it to another generation, which I'm guessing this is about a 3-generation church, which handed it to another generation, and that's you. And you have a heritage. Some of you young men, the future of that heritage is yours. We have a great cloud of witnesses. People who went before, who stood before, who did incredible things. I will be preaching in a couple weeks in a Creek Indian church. I preach there every year out in Oklahoma. There are Creek, among the reservations and tribes in Oklahoma, there are a number of independent Baptist churches. Because Baptist missionaries went to those Indian tribes and preachers and started churches and did a work for God. Isaac McCoy was one of the most famous. They went and they did a work for God and started churches, and those churches go on to this day. Not led by the people that founded them. There's a church in Oklahoma that was the first Baptist church among the reservations there, and they have a wall in their church. Not quite as long as this, but close. And they have a whole wall. It's a first church, which led to this church, and this church, and this church, which led to this church, and this, and it's all sketched out all along the wall. A heritage that went before them. And God did incredible things. I'll tell you one story from an Indian church, and I'll be done, to give you the idea. I pastored in Marion, Indiana, at Emmanuel Baptist Church. They had a big get-together every year called Massinawa there, and they reenact a famous battle with the Indians. And so, you know Massinawa? You know? Oh, you were? Okay. Sorry. So I went to Massinawa, and when you're going to the reenactment, the map tells you to turn at the Indian Village Baptist Church Cemetery. I said, well, that's an interesting name. So I got to looking up Indian Village Baptist Church. And we went to the spot, and we got out, and there's a tombstone there that says Mashinga Misha, Chief Miami Indians, Deacon and Faithful Servant of Jesus Christ. That's what it says on the tomb. And then next to the spot where the church was, there is a slab and a memorial, what used to be the Indian Village Baptist Church Christian School. So I get to researching all this. And it turned out, for a period of time, when the Miami Indians were there and they first began to lose battles, and they were considered so ferocious, the United States government said no white men can go in there. No churches can be founded, nothing. But there was a young woman who'd been taken captive and by the Delaware Indians, sold to the Miami Indians. And at the time, she was an adult by the time they called for all the captives to be returned, and she didn't want to be returned. And she's married to Chief. And the Chief died, and in spite of all the things you hear, every Indian was recognized as the owner of 160 acres, and every chief 500 acres. So they have farms all along the Mississinawa River. And this woman's husband died, and she's got a 500-acre farm. And she can't run it herself, so she appeals to her family back in Delaware and Pennsylvania, said if someone would come out and run the farm for her because she did not want to leave so she could continue to live there, that when she died, she would leave that 500 acres to that person. She's got relatives in a Baptist church who are praying and pleading that God would open the door for the gospel to go to the Miami Indians. She has a nephew she's never met, but he's a member of that Baptist church. And he agrees. And he's able to go as the inheritor of that property and live on the Miami reservation. And he begins to witness to people. And some folks get saved. And Mashingo Misha gets saved. The war chief from the battle of Missinawa gets saved. And they start a Baptist church together. First bus ministry, only was a wagon ministry. Mashingo Misha ran a wagon all along the Missinawa River through all those farms on Sunday morning to pick up people and bring them to church. And they started a church there, preached the gospel. And the government sent out a school teacher for the reservation. And the school teacher wasn't saved. And the leaders, the Miami tribe, as the gospel is spreading, said, we don't want an unsaved man teaching our children. So they sent him back. And they started a Christian school right there on that property. Time went on, and many of the Miami Indians would sell their farms and move into town, often into Marion. So I've discovered all this, and I'm telling this story to our church. And they say, we know. I had families that were Miami Indians, and I didn't even know they were Miami Indians because so many of the folks from the Indian Village Baptist Church moved into the town of Marion that they had started a Baptist church, and that was the church I was pastoring. My piano player, godly Christian woman, she passed away the very week I left. She had been she was 89. She had been a piano player there for 77 years from age 12 on. Never met a more godly person in my life. They had one hospital in Marion. If she wasn't in church, I didn't even ask anybody. I just went to the hospital because she must be in the hospital. Because if she wasn't in the hospital, she was in church. She said, yeah, she got saved at age 12. When the church in Marion and the Indian Village Baptist Church was still meeting at that time, held a joint crusade together. Alternating one night here, one night there, one night here, one night there. And she got saved one night at the Indian Village Baptist Church. It was a great heritage. You and I have a great heritage. Heroes have gone before us. They handed down to us what we have. We don't know all their names, and we don't know all of what they did, but for 2,000 years, we have had a great heritage. We have a great cloud of witnesses. So now here's the question. Does that heritage stop with us? because we failed it? Or does it go on to another generation? You and I will decide that. We have a great heritage that has been handed to us. Some of you young men right here, you'll decide whether that heritage goes on in this church. Long after I'm gone and forgotten about, and never do a Baptist Heritage Conference again. Some of you folks will be deciding whether this heritage goes on or not. Glory to God, we have a great cloud of witnesses. Lord speaks to your heart. Do not miss this moment. Pastor.
Oh, what a blessing to have these reminders here tonight. Maybe tonight it would just be laid upon your heart by God to thank God for the heritage that He's given to us, and that there might be a recommitment in our hearts tonight. God, I will carry on that godly heritage, that biblical heritage, others as well. As the piano begins to play here tonight, I just want to encourage you to be obedient to the Lord. However He speaks to your heart, I encourage you to do, maybe some changes need to be made, or maybe just some shoring up. Saying, I've kind of let some things go. But now I see tonight that these doctrinally distinctive beliefs from the Bible are worthy and necessary to carry on. It's true that Sandy Valley Baptist Temple will still be here with the next generation picks up those same doctrinal distinctives, carries them out. So it's up to me, it's up to you, as parents, as people in this church, to know what they are and convey them to the next generation. One of the reasons that we have what we have termed our Sandy Valley Luncheon is for that very reason. As part of it, we go over our Baptist distinctives. Why are we a Baptist church? We want everyone that comes in this church as a member of this church. Salvation, yes. Baptism, yes. But we want them to know exactly what we're here for, what we believe, why we believe it.